Kale Draconis had spent 2 years, on and off, following the fragile thread of a monthly letter and one difficult visit that had led, gradually, to more, until the trail simply stopped 18 months ago, when Lyra's replies grew shorter, then infrequent, then finally silent altogether, with no explanation beyond a single final note that read only, asterisk things have changed. I need you to stop writing for a while. Asterisk. He hadn't stopped hoping. He'd simply stopped intruding, understanding, from 3 years of hard-won patience, that pushing past a boundary Lyra had drawn would undo every fragile inch of trust he'd spent that time carefully earning. He learned the truth the way most kings eventually learn anything they've been too proud or too afraid to ask about directly, through a trade delegation's routine report delivered to his war table on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, mentioning almost in passing that the Healers Guild in the eastern border territories had recently come under the formal patronage of King Orion Frostfang of the Northern Territory Valcrest, following his marriage, the previous spring, to the guild's founder. Kale read the line 3 times before the words fully assembled themselves into meaning. His marriage, the previous spring, to the guild's founder. He didn't summon Harwick. He didn't call a council session. He simply sat alone in the war room he'd occupied for 14 years, staring at a single line of routine trade correspondence, and understood, with a devastation that felt considerably different from the grief he'd carried for a decade, that somewhere along the careful, patient path he'd been walking toward redemption, the woman he'd been walking toward had built an entire life that no longer required him at all. He traveled north within the week. Not to reclaim her. He told himself that, repeatedly, through 3 weeks of hard mountain travel, until he almost believed it. Simply to understand. Simply to see, with his own eyes, exactly what he'd lost the right to hope for, so he could finally, properly let it go. He arrived at Valcrest's Silver Fortress on a clear winter evening, the aurora bleeding pale green and violet across a northern sky he'd never once seen before, and found himself standing at the edge of a grand hall, watching Queen Lyra Ashbourne, radiant, composed, utterly at ease in a way he had never once managed to make her feel in 6 years of marriage to him, stand beside a tall, fair-haired king whose hand rested, easy and unhesitating, at the small of her back. She was laughing at something the king had said. Genuinely, freely, the particular unguarded laugh Kale remembered from the earliest, easiest days of their own courtship, before politics and fear and a forged letter had taught her, slowly, to guard it. He understood, watching her, that he had come north expecting to find grief. He had found, instead, a woman entirely, thoroughly happy, and a king who had never once given her a single reason to need forgiving. 4 years had passed since the moon goddess's difficult gift, 4 years of Kale Draconis rebuilding, carefully and without any guarantee of reward, exactly the kind of patient trust he had once destroyed in a single frightened, exhausted signature. He had written to Ren every month, without fail, watching a daughter he barely knew grow, across careful, distant correspondence, into a girl of considerable wit and gentleness, following in her mother's healing footsteps with an aptitude that made his chest ache every time a new letter described some fresh accomplishment he'd had no part in nurturing. He had visited Lyra's guild twice more in those 4 years, each visit shorter and considerably more carefully bounded than the first, Lyra's own guardedness thawing by degrees, so gradual that Kale had learned to measure hope in inches rather than miles. She had, slowly, begun answering his letters with more than the barest necessary courtesy. She had, on his second visit, allowed him to stay a full week rather than 3 days. She had, on his third, permitted him to accompany Ren on a healer's errand to a nearby village, the two of them walking together in careful, companionable silence that had felt, to Kale, like the first genuinely solid ground he'd stood on in years. He had allowed himself, somewhere in the careful accumulation of those small, hard-won inches, to hope for something he had never once let himself name directly. Not reconciliation exactly, not the neat restoration of everything he destroyed, but something. A door left open long enough, eventually, that walking through it together might genuinely become possible. He had no way of knowing that King Orion Frostfang had entered Lyra's life during the 18 months her letters had grown silent. Not through any dramatic rescue or grand romantic gesture, but through the same patient, ordinary accumulation of trust Cale himself had spent 4 years trying to rebuild, except considerably easier to extend. Cale would come to understand, when the man asking for it had never once given anyone reason to withhold it in the first place. Orion Frostfang ruled Valcrest, a northern territory known for its silver mines and its unusually progressive council structure, a kingdom his own father had built on principles of consultation and consensus rather than the older, harder traditions most northern territories still favored. He had never married, not from any particular reluctance, but because, at 31, he had simply never encountered a mate bond, and had ruled instead on the strength of genuine partnership with his council, considerable personal decency, and a reputation across 3 neighboring territories for exactly the kind of quiet, unshakable reliability that made allies trust him instinctively and enemies think twice before testing him. He had traveled to the Eastern Healers Guild 18 months earlier for entirely mundane reasons, negotiating formal support for expanding Valcrest's own limited medical training, a project his council had been pressing for 2 years. He had met Lyra Ashbourne across a negotiation table and had found himself, over the following months of careful, professional correspondence that gradually became something considerably warmer, genuinely and completely without artifice, falling in love with a woman who had spent a decade building herself into someone she was, herself, only beginning to properly recognize as worthy of exactly that kind of uncomplicated devotion. The bond between them had not been the moon's undeniable, overwhelming pull. It had been something else entirely, chosen, deliberate, built through 18 months of genuine partnership rather than any single overwhelming moment neither of them had needed to earn. Lyra had married him the following spring, in a ceremony considerably smaller than Valcrest's court would have preferred, understanding, better than anyone alive, exactly how much genuine choice actually mattered compared to any bond fate might otherwise have decided for her. She had stopped writing to Cale during those 18 months, not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine, careful uncertainty about what continuing to write meant. Once something real had begun growing in her own life that she wasn't yet ready to explain to a man whose place in it remained, even 4 years into careful reconciliation, considerably more complicated than either of them had ever properly named. Cale arrived at Valcrest's Silver Fortress, knowing none of this. He arrived carrying 4 years of patient hope, and understood, within his first hour inside those unfamiliar walls, exactly how completely that hope had already, quietly, permanently arrived too late. The trade delegation's report sat on Cale's desk for 2 full days before he finally forced himself to reread it properly, the single devastating line buried within 3 pages of otherwise routine correspondence regarding grain tariffs and border toll agreements. The Eastern Healers Guild has secured formal patronage from Valcrest's crown, following the founder's marriage this past spring to King Orion Frostfang. He had read it the first time in passing, his mind considerably more occupied with the tariff negotiations the report's other pages actually concerned, and had felt the sentence land somewhere in his chest only hours later, in the quiet of his own private study, the delayed impact considerably more devastating for having ambushed him so far removed from any careful preparation. "You've been staring at that same page for an hour," Harwick observed, finding him there well past the dinner hour, the general's own hair now fully gray after 14 years of loyal, patient service. "Lyra married," Cale said, the words strange and enormous in his own mouth. "This past spring." To King Orion Frostvang of Valcrest. Harwick's expression shifted through several careful stages, surprise, and beneath it, something that looked, to Cale's exhausted eyes, uncomfortably close to relief. "You didn't know," Harwick said, not quite a question. "Her letter stopped 18 months ago," Cale said. I don't know what I assumed, that she needed distance, that the guild was demanding more of her time. I never once considered that she might have simply moved on to something I had no part in at all."
Cale.
Harwick rarely used his given name rather than his title, and the informality landed with a weight of its own. "You've spent 4 years rebuilding something careful and slow with that woman. You never once asked her, in all that time, whether she intended that rebuilding to eventually lead somewhere specific." "I didn't think I had the right to ask," Cale admitted. "Not after everything. I told myself patience was the only honest offering I actually had left to give her. And now—" Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring at the same devastating line of trade correspondence, understanding with growing, uncomfortable clarity exactly what 4 years of careful, patient silence had actually cost him, not through any dishonesty on Lyra's part, but through his own persistent failure to ever ask directly what he actually hoped that patience might eventually be building toward. "I need to see her," he said finally. "Not to disrupt anything. Simply to understand, properly, what's actually happened, rather than continuing to imagine a future I apparently have no genuine claim to at all." "Cale," Harwick said carefully, "consider, before you travel 3 weeks north on a whim born from a single line of trade correspondence, exactly what you're actually hoping to find at the end of that journey. If she's genuinely happy, genuinely settled with a man who never once gave her reason to doubt him, what does traveling north to confirm that actually accomplish, beyond reopening a wound you've spent for years carefully, patiently closing?" "I don't know," Cale admitted. "I only know that not going feels considerably worse than whatever I might find when I get there." He departed within the week, understanding, even as he gave the order to prepare his escort, that Harwick's careful warning carried considerably more wisdom than his own grief-driven urgency was currently willing to properly absorb. Valcrest's silver fortress rose from a mountain valley Cale had never once traveled through in 14 years of rule. Considerably further north than Duskmoor's own territory extended, its architecture built from pale, luminous stone that caught and held moonlight in a way that made the entire structure seem, even in ordinary daylight, faintly, permanently lit from within. He arrived on a clear winter evening, the aurora bleeding pale green and violet across a sky he had never once seen so vividly displayed, and presented himself at the fortress gates under formal diplomatic pretense, a routine border matter requiring the Northern King's personal attention, a fiction thin enough that Cale understood. Even offering it, the guards likely saw straight through it within moments of his arrival. He was granted audience regardless, escorted through halls considerably grander and considerably warmer, in every sense, than Duskmoor's own black stone corridors had ever managed to feel, genuine warmth in the greetings offered by passing staff, genuine ease in the way courtiers moved through spaces that felt, unmistakably, like a kingdom governed by people who trusted each other rather than one carefully, permanently managing old grief and older suspicion. He found the grand hall already occupied by an evening gathering, not a formal state occasion, simply the ordinary, comfortable business of a royal court at the end of an ordinary day. Musicians playing something unhurried in one corner, small clusters of courtiers in easy, genuine conversation. He saw her before he was properly announced. Lyra stood near the hall's central hearth, dressed in Valcrest's pale silver and deep blue rather than any color Cale had ever seen her wear, her dark hair loose in a way she'd rarely worn it even in their earliest, happiest years together, laughing at something the tall, fair-haired man beside her had just said. King Orion Frostfang stood with the particular easy confidence of a man entirely secure in his own kingdom and his own life, his hand resting at the small of Lyra's back with an unhesitating familiarity that made Cale's chest tighten with a grief he hadn't properly prepared himself to feel this immediately, this completely. She looked, watching her from across the hall, considerably more radiant than Cale had ever once managed to make her feel. Not the careful, guarded warmth she'd extended him across 4 years of patient, difficult reconciliation, but something entirely unguarded, entirely free. "Your Majesty," a steward's careful voice, at his elbow, drew his attention back to his own immediate surroundings. "King Frostfang will receive you shortly. If you'd care to wait in the receiving chamber." "No," Cale said, before he could properly think better of it. "I'd like to simply observe for a moment, if that's permitted." The steward hesitated, clearly uncertain of proper protocol for a visiting king who wished to loiter unannounced at the edge of an informal court gathering, but gestured toward a quiet alcove near the hall's entrance regardless. Cale stood there for the better part of 20 minutes, watching Lyra move through her own court with an ease and authority that struck him with fresh, devastating force. This was not the woman he had once known, careful and guarded even in her own strength, forever, quietly bracing for some fresh betrayal. This was a woman who had built, or found, or simply finally allowed herself an entire life in which that bracing had become unnecessary. Orion caught sight of him first, a tall, considerable figure moving through his own crowded hall with the particular attentiveness of a genuinely good host, noticing the unfamiliar visitor at the room's edge before anyone else present had thought to properly announce him. "You must be King Draconis," Orion said, crossing to Cale's alcove with an open, unguarded warmth that Cale found, disorientingly, he had no genuine framework for resenting. "Lyra's mentioned you, of course." "I confess I hadn't expected a visit quite this unannounced." "I apologize for the intrusion," Cale said, and meant it, though the apology cost him considerably more composure than he'd anticipated it requiring. "I learned of your marriage rather recently. I traveled north to understand, properly, what had happened, not to disrupt anything, Your Majesty. I promise you that." Something in Orion's steady, assessing gaze suggested he understood, immediately and completely, considerably more than Cale's careful diplomatic phrasing had actually admitted. "Come," Orion said, gesturing toward the hall's far side, where Lyra had finally noticed the unfamiliar exchange and was watching them both with an expression Cale couldn't yet properly read. "I think, whatever brought you north, this conversation deserves considerably more privacy than my own crowded court currently offers." Lyra's expression, as Cale and Orion crossed the hall toward her, cycled through shock, careful composure, and something considerably more complicated Cale understood, with a sinking heart, wasn't the fragile, cautious warmth he'd spent 4 years carefully cultivating.
"Cale."
Her voice carried genuine surprise, and beneath it, something that had, in 4 years of careful correspondence, never once been present in quite this particular combination, settled confidence, entirely unafraid of whatever conversation his sudden appearance might require. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Cale said. "I should have written ahead. I only learned about." He gestured, vaguely, encompassing Orion's presence beside her, the pale silver and blue of her gown, the entire transformed landscape of a life he had apparently, thoroughly missed. "I only learned recently, and I found I couldn't simply write and wait for a reply. I needed to understand properly." "Understand what, exactly?" Lyra asked, and though her voice remained careful, Cale heard nothing defensive in it, only genuine, direct curiosity about precisely what he'd traveled 3 weeks north expecting to find. "Why you stopped writing," Cale admitted. "I told myself for 18 months that you needed distance." I never once considered that you might have simply found something that made continuing our correspondence complicated, in ways I had no part in. Orion, watching this exchange with the same careful, unguarded attentiveness he'd shown at the alcove, spoke before Lyra could answer. I should give you two some privacy, he said. This conversation, I think, belongs to the pair of you considerably more than it belongs to me standing here as audience. You don't have to leave, Lyra said, reaching for his hand with an easy, unthinking familiarity that landed, for Cale, like a physical blow. Whatever Cale's come to ask, I don't have anything to say to him that requires your absence. Something in that simple, unhesitating gesture, you don't have to leave, told Cale, more completely than any formal explanation could have, exactly how thoroughly he had already lost whatever fragile ground 4 years of patient rebuilding had once secured. I stopped writing, Lyra said, turning back to Cale, because I met Orion during a formal negotiation regarding Volcrest's support for the Guild's expansion and found myself, over several months of entirely ordinary, professional correspondence, genuinely falling for a man who had never once given me reason to doubt him. I didn't know at first what to do with that, how to keep writing to you, carefully rebuilding whatever trust we'd managed across 4 years, while something entirely different was also genuinely growing in my own life. You could have told me, Cale said, though the words came out considerably less steady than he'd intended. I could have, Lyra agreed. I think, honestly, I was afraid of what telling you would cost. Not because I owed you anything, Cale, but because 4 years of careful correspondence had genuinely mattered to me, in ways I hadn't fully examined until I understood I was choosing something else instead. I didn't know how to end one thing honestly while beginning another, so I simply stopped and told myself I'd explain properly, eventually, once I understood my own feelings well enough to do so without hurting anyone unnecessarily. And now?
Cale asked.
Now you've traveled 3 weeks to hear it from me directly, Lyra said, something gentle but entirely unwavering in her voice, rather than from a line of trade correspondence you happened to stumble across. I'm sorry it happened that way, Cale. You deserved better than learning it secondhand. But I'm not sorry about what actually happened. Orion is genuinely good, in ways I spent considerable years believing I might never actually get to experience from someone who wanted me, not for what my exile made politically useful, not out of guilt over a debt he owed me, simply because he wanted to know me patiently and honestly for exactly who I actually am. The words landed with devastating precision, Cale understanding, hearing them, exactly how thoroughly they described everything his own 4 years of careful courtship had never quite managed to become. Not guilt exactly, not entirely, but never fully free of it either, never quite reaching the uncomplicated, ordinary ease Lyra now described with such quiet, genuine certainty. I'm happy for you, Cale said, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that beneath the devastating grief settling into his chest, some part of the sentiment was even genuinely true. Cale stayed in Volcrest 3 days, at Orion's genuine, unhesitating invitation, understanding, by the second morning, that the Northern King's hospitality carried none of the careful, defensive calculation Cale might once have expected from a man whose wife's former husband had arrived unannounced at his own court. He found Orion in the fortress's training yard on that second morning, working through combat forms alone in the pale, early light, and found himself watching, genuinely curious about a man whose own history he understood almost nothing about. You're not what I expected, Cale admitted, once Orion had noticed him and paused, unbothered, to towel the sweat from his face. What did you expect? I don't entirely know, Cale said honestly. Someone more guarded, perhaps. Someone who'd want me gone within the hour, rather than genuinely welcoming me to stay. Orion considered this, settling onto a low bench at the training yard's edge, gesturing for Cale to join him. I've known Lyra's history since our earliest conversations, he said. She never hid it from me, or softened it for my comfort. She told me, plainly, what happened. The forged letter, the exile, the son she buried alone in frozen ground. I understood, hearing it, exactly what kind of grief I was choosing to build a life alongside if I chose to pursue anything with her at all. And you chose anyway. I chose because the grief wasn't the whole of her, Orion said. I met a woman who'd built an entire guild from nothing, who'd raised a remarkable daughter alone, who'd survived considerably more than most people ever have to and come out the other side, somehow, still capable of genuine warmth rather than permanent bitterness. I fell in love with that woman, Kale, not with the tragedy that shaped her. I understand you're a considerable part of why that tragedy exists in the first place, and I won't pretend that doesn't complicate my feelings toward you personally. But I also understand, from everything she's told me, that you've spent 4 years genuinely trying to earn back some measure of trust, rather than simply demanding it. That matters, even if it doesn't change what I want for my own future with her. Kale absorbed this with a grief considerably more complicated than simple jealousy, something closer to genuine respect, tangled inextricably with everything he understood he had permanently lost. You never gave her reason to doubt you, Kale said. Not once, across 18 months, from what she's described. I spent 6 years of marriage giving her exactly that reason in the end, when it mattered most. I'm not a better man than you, Orion said, something careful and genuine in his voice. I've simply never been tested the way you were tested that particular night. I don't know, honestly, what I would have done, facing a war council's desperate certainty and a forged letter convincing enough to fool considerably more experienced judges than either of us. I'd like to believe I'd have asked better questions. I understand that's an easy thing to believe, having never actually faced the choice myself. That's more generosity than I expected, Kale admitted. I'm not offering it for your benefit, Orion said, something wry entering his voice. I'm offering it because Lyra genuinely values whatever careful, patient reconciliation you've managed with her these past 4 years, and because Ren adores the father she's slowly gotten to know through your letters. I have no interest in being the man who makes either of them choose between happiness with me and whatever relationship they're still building with you. That would make me considerably less decent than I'd like to believe I actually am. Kale sat with that for a long moment, watching the pale winter light shift across Volcrest's silver walls, understanding with growing, uncomfortable clarity exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged what kind of confrontation this journey north might actually require. He had traveled expecting, somewhere in his own quiet, unexamined hope, either rejection sharp enough to finally release him, or reconciliation generous enough to somehow restore what he'd lost. He had found, instead, a genuinely decent man who bore him no particular malice, standing beside a woman who had built, without any particular need for Kale's continued presence, an entire life considerably more whole than anything Kale had ever managed to offer her himself. Ren found him on the 3rd afternoon, in the fortress's quiet library, considerably grander than her mother's own modest guild collection, though Kale noted, with a private, aching fondness, that several of the volumes on the nearest shelf carried the guild's own distinctive binding, brought north along with everything else that had genuinely mattered in the move. Mom said you're leaving tomorrow, she said, settling into the chair across from his without waiting for invitation, 13 now, considerably taller than the 9-year-old who'd first asked him, with uncomplicated directness, whether he intended to stay. I am, Kale confirmed. I don't think there's much more purpose in extending the visit, given everything I've learned since I arrived. Are you sad? Ren asked, with the same blunt honesty he remembered from their earliest conversations, though considerably more careful now, more aware of exactly what weight her questions might carry. Very, Kale admitted, Understanding this particular relationship required considerably more honesty than careful, protective deflection would ever properly serve. I think some part of me hoped, all these years, that patience alone would eventually be enough to earn back everything I lost. I understand now that it was never simply a matter of patience. Your mother needed to build a genuinely happy life, Ren, not wait indefinitely for me to earn my way back into the one I destroyed. Do you like Orion? Ren asked. Kale considered the question seriously, understanding her directness deserved an equally honest answer. I do, he said, somewhat to his own surprise, hearing himself say it aloud. He's genuinely good to your mother. Genuinely good to you, from everything I've observed these past 3 days. I wish, honestly, that made this considerably easier to accept than it actually is. He's kind, Ren said. He never makes me feel like I'm less important than council business, or whatever else kings usually worry about. She paused, something careful entering her voice. I don't think that means I love you less, though, in case that's what you're worried about. Kale felt his chest tighten with an emotion too large and complicated to properly name, watching his daughter, considerably wiser than her years, considerably more perceptive than most adults he'd known across 14 years of careful, guarded court politics, offer him exactly the reassurance he had known he needed until she'd already given it. Thank you, he said quietly. That means considerably more than you probably understand. I do understand, Ren said, with the particular, patient firmness of someone who had spent years growing up in the careful, complicated space between a mother's hard-won happiness and a father's slow, patient redemption. You made a mistake, a big one before I was born. But you've spent my whole life trying to actually fix what you could, instead of just apologizing once and expecting that to be enough. I noticed that, Papa, even when it's hard to watch you and Mom figure out what that actually means going forward. Papa, Kale repeated, quiet, something in the word landing with considerably more weight than she'd probably intended. Is that all right? Ren asked, suddenly uncertain in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. I've been thinking about it for a while. Your Majesty felt too formal, and just Kale felt, I don't know, like you were just anyone, instead of actually my father. It's more than all right, Kale said, his voice considerably less steady than he wanted it to be. It's the best thing anyone said to me since I arrived. They sat together a while longer, the quiet library settling comfortably around them, and Kale understood, watching his daughter select a book from the guild's own familiar shelf with practiced, easy confidence, that whatever else this devastating journey had cost him, it had also, somehow, delivered exactly the one thing he hadn't fully realized he still needed to properly claim. Kale's departure was delayed, unexpectedly, by 2 days, Orion's council having scheduled, weeks earlier, a formal public ceremony to mark the guild's official expansion into Volcrest territory, an occasion Lyra herself was scheduled to address before the assembled northern nobility as both the guild's founder and Volcrest's queen. You should stay, Lyra told him, finding him in the fortress's outer courtyard the evening before, considering his escort's departure preparations with an unreadable expression. Not for my sake, necessarily. But I think you should see this, Kale. Understand it properly, rather than leaving with only the private conversations we've had these past 3 days. See what, exactly?
Kale asked.
Who I've actually become, Lyra said, something careful but genuine in her voice. You've spent 4 years getting to know a woman writing letters from a healer's guild, carefully guarded, still working through considerable grief. I think you should see the version of me that exists in front of an entire court, standing as an equal partner to a king who's never once needed to remind anyone that my voice belongs in that room just as much as his own. Kale stayed. He stood the following evening at the edge of Volcrest's grand hall, considerably more crowded now than his first bewildering evening's arrival, Formal banners hung throughout the space in Volcrest's silver and blue alongside the guild's own emerging crest, a healer's mortar and pestle rendered in careful, deliberate silverwork that Kale understood. Watching it catch the hall's abundant candlelight represented something genuinely, thoroughly earned rather than simply granted. Orion spoke first, formal and warm, addressing his assembled nobility with the easy, genuine authority of a king entirely secure in both his own judgment and his own choices. He spoke of the guild's remarkable growth, of the healers it had trained now serving communities across 4 separate territories, of his own genuine pride in supporting work that mattered considerably more, in his own careful assessment, than most of the formal diplomacy that usually occupied a royal court's attention. Then he turned and extended his hand toward Lyra, standing at his side throughout the entire address, and Kale watched her step forward to address the assembled court herself, not as a king's consort granted the privilege of speaking, but as an equal ruler whose own accomplishments had earned this particular moment entirely on their own considerable merit. 10 years ago, Lyra said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the grand hall's attentive silence, I was cast out of my home, accused of a betrayal I never committed, carrying children whose father never knew they existed until it was far too late to matter to the parts of their lives that had already happened without him. Kale felt every eye in the hall that recognized him shift, briefly, in his direction, though Lyra's own gaze never once wavered from the assembled crowd, her composure entirely unshaken by whatever private history this particular public admission might have stirred. I built something from that devastation over the following decade, she continued, not because I was owed some grand redemption for surviving it, but because building mattered considerably more to me than simply enduring what had happened. I trained as a healer properly for the first time in my life. I raised a daughter who has grown into someone I am, every single day, considerably more proud of than any other accomplishment I could possibly name. And I found, eventually, a partner who never once needed me to be anything other than exactly who those 10 difficult years had actually made me. She glanced toward Orion, something genuine and unguarded passing between them, and Kale understood, watching it, exactly what 4 years of his own careful, patient correspondence had never quite managed to earn, not through any particular failure of effort, but simply because some things, once broken thoroughly enough, could be rebuilt into something meaningful without ever again becoming the exact thing they'd been before the breaking. This guild exists, Lyra said, addressing the assembled court with a final, quiet certainty, because devastation doesn't have to be the end of anyone's story, provided they're given the genuine chance and the genuine partnership to build something considerably better from what remains. The hall erupted into genuine, warm applause, and Kale stood at its edge, watching the woman he had once destroyed stand as an equal, celebrated ruler beside a king who had never once given her reason to doubt him, and understood, with a clarity that offered no comfort whatsoever, exactly what his own 4 years of careful patience had actually been building toward all along. Not reconciliation. Simply the fullest, most devastating possible understanding of precisely what he had permanently, irrevocably lost. Kale found Lyra alone, the following morning, in a quiet garden courtyard tucked behind Volcrest's grand hall, considerably smaller and more private than the fortress's other, grander spaces, clearly a spot she'd claimed for herself amid the formal demands of her new life. I'm leaving within the hour, he said, settling onto the low stone bench beside her without quite asking permission, though she made no move to object. I know, Lyra said. Orion mentioned your escorts preparing to depart. They sat together a while in comfortable, considered silence, the pale northern morning settling around them with a stillness that felt, to Kale, considerably more peaceful than anything he'd carried with him through 3 weeks of difficult, uncertain travel. I owe you an apology, he said finally, for arriving the way I did. Uninvited, unannounced, carrying considerably more hope than I had any right to still be carrying after 4 years. You don't owe me that, Lyra said. I understand why you came, Kale. I might have done the same in your position, learning something that significant secondhand from a line of trade correspondence, rather than from the person it actually concerned. I think, Kale admitted slowly, some part of me hoped, arriving here, that I might still find some path back toward what we once had. I understand now that path never genuinely existed, not because you're unkind, or because 4 years of patient correspondence meant nothing, but because you needed to build a life that didn't require my forgiveness or my continued presence to feel genuinely whole. That's considerably more self-aware than I expected you to arrive at, in the space of 3 difficult days, Lyra said, something almost gentle entering her voice. Orion helped, Kale admitted. Watching him, watching how he loves you, without guilt, without any old debt hanging over every gesture, helped me understand exactly what I never quite managed to offer you myself, however genuinely I tried. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, considering him with an expression that carried, for the first time since his arrival, something that looked almost like genuine tenderness rather than careful, guarded distance. I don't regret the 4 years we spent rebuilding what we could, she said finally. I want you to understand that clearly before you leave. You gave Ren a father she genuinely knows and loves, even from a careful distance. You gave me the chance to properly grieve everything that happened, rather than simply carrying it alone forever. That mattered, Kale. It still matters, regardless of what happened after. But it's not enough, Kale said, to build a future on. No, Lyra agreed, gentle but entirely certain. It's not. What we could have rebuilt, if everything had gone differently, I think it would always have carried the weight of what broke it in the first place. Orion and I built something without that weight attached. I don't think that makes what you and I share now less genuine. I simply think it makes it something different than what it once was, and something different than what it will ever become again. Kale absorbed this with a grief that felt, for the first time in 10 years, considerably more like genuine acceptance than raw devastation. What happens now, he asked, between us, between me and Ren? Nothing has to change on that front, Lyra said. You're still her father, Kale. That doesn't stop being true because Orion and I built a life she's also come to genuinely love. Keep writing. Keep visiting when it's welcome. I think, honestly, that's the version of this you've actually earned. Not a reunion, but a genuine, ongoing place in her life. And in mine, that doesn't require either of us to pretend the past 10 years unfolded any differently than they actually did. Kale nodded slowly, understanding, with a clarity that finally offered something like peace, exactly what he was being offered. Considerably smaller than the future he'd once, quietly, foolishly hoped this journey might restore, and considerably more honest than any version of reconciliation built on unspoken, unresolved longing could ever have genuinely become. Thank you, he said, for building something this good, Lyra. Whatever it cost me to watch it happen without me, I understand, now, that it was always going to be worth it, for you and for Ren both. Thank you, Lyra said, for finally coming to see it, instead of simply imagining it safely from a distance. I think that took considerable courage, Kale, even if it cost you something you weren't fully prepared to lose. Kale rode south from Volcrest's Silver Fortress the following morning, the aurora long since faded. An ordinary gray winter sky stretched overhead instead, and understood, watching the fortress recede behind him, that he was leaving with considerably less than he had traveled north hoping to reclaim. He was leaving, also, with something he hadn't fully anticipated needing, a clear, complete understanding of exactly where the story of himself and Lyra Ashbourne had genuinely, permanently ended, and a considerably more honest sense of what remained, still real and still worth carefully tending in its careful, ordinary aftermath. He wrote to Ren the following month, exactly as he had for 4 years running, and found himself composing the letter, describing the aurora he'd seen for the first time, the silver fortress's luminous stone, the genuine warmth of a court that trusted itself in ways his own had only recently, carefully begun to properly rebuild. He did not write about grief. He understood, by then, that Ren carried enough of her own complicated feelings about the whole difficult situation without needing her father's additional weight added to it. He visited again the following spring, carefully, briefly, exactly as Lyra had suggested, understanding now precisely what role he genuinely occupied in the family that continued, without him, to grow and flourish in Volcrest's northern territory. He watched Ren grow further into her mother's healing tradition, watched Lyra rule alongside Orion with a settled confidence that never once required Kale's continued presence to feel complete, watched a family that had built itself, deliberately and with genuine care, into exactly the kind of wholeness his own decade-old failure had once seemed to permanently foreclose. He never remarried. Some part of him understood, riding south that final morning from Volcrest, that whatever capacity he'd once had for that particular kind of love had been spent, permanently and without possibility of restoration, on a woman who had needed considerably more than his eventual, hard-won honesty to build the life she'd actually deserved all along. He ruled Duskmoor for the remainder of his reign with the same careful, diligent competence that had once, mistakenly, felt like sufficient atonement, except now, understanding fully and completely exactly what that competence had never actually restored, he carried it considerably more honestly, no longer mistaking careful governance for genuine redemption, understanding instead that some losses, once complete, simply remained lost, regardless of how much careful, patient work followed in their wake. He thought of Lyra often, in the years that followed, not with the raw, consuming grief that had once defined a full decade of his life, but with something quieter, more settled, closer to genuine gratitude than continued mourning. She had survived what he'd done to her. She had built, from the wreckage of his own worst failure, something genuinely, thoroughly whole. He understood, finally, watching his own reign continue without her, exactly what the moon goddess's difficult gift had actually offered him all those years earlier. Not the restoration he had originally foolishly hoped for, but something considerably harder and considerably more honest. The truth. Fully, completely faced at last. Some losses, he understood now, could never be undone. They could only, eventually, be properly grieved and carefully, honestly carried forward into whatever remained of a life that would never again include the thing that had been lost. That, he came to understand across the remaining years of his reign, was not failure. It was simply, finally, the truth, accepted at last, considerably too late to change anything that had already happened, but not, he understood, too late to change how he chose to carry it, for whatever years remained.
The end.